listener production.
Hi, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. A rescue mission to bring back 2 astronauts stuck in space is officially underway.
Freedom SpaceX on the Big Loop soft capture confirmed.
That was the SpaceX capsule docking at the International Space Station yesterday, which was the start of the 5-month rescue mission. So how does an operation like this work? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It is Tuesday, the 1st of October.
Morning, Sash. We start today in the Middle East, where Israel has reportedly informed the US of its plans for a limited ground invasion of Lebanon. CBS is reporting that could happen as soon as today, despite calls from the international community for Israel to show restraint. Hezbollah has signalled it is ready should a ground invasion happen, and this morning our time, Israel launched a number of small precision raids across the border, but plans for a wider operation have not yet been decided on.
Yeah, so why has Benjamin Netanyahu shifted all his focus to Lebanon, or what feels like all of his focus? It's worth noting there are still bombs going off in Gaza. There are still airstrikes happening. People are still dying and being displaced in Gaza. But this focus on Lebanon is in response to displaced Israelis who have had to flee their homes close to the border with the country because Hezbollah has been bombarding the region with rockets since October last year in response to the war in Gaza. And since last week's escalation, more than 1,200 Lebanese people have been killed in strikes, the militant group's leader among them, as well as civilians, women and children. And just coming back home, a special envoy to combat Islamophobia has now been appointed by the Australian government. Now, you might remember back in July, a special envoy against anti-Semitism was appointed by Labor, and this was following an increase in tensions after the October 7 attack and then the subsequent war in Gaza. At the time, the government said, we will appoint one for Islamophobia shortly. Shortly turned into 3 months. There was a deadline set by the Australian National Imams Council, and they warned the delay would become farcical if a person was not found by the end of September. So Labor just sneaking in there to announce that Aftab Malik, he is a United Nations Alliance of Civilizations global expert on Muslim affairs. He's taking the role and he'll serve in it for 3 years.
Dating apps have been given 6 months to become compliant with a new Australian code of conduct designed to make them safer. So the online dating code kicks in today and requires apps like Tinder and Hinge to detect potential incidents of online harm and take action against those users. So there's a big list here, Sash, stick with me. The apps themselves, they'll be required to clearly display reporting mechanisms, proactively contact law enforcement in the case of imminent threats, and submit regular reports to the eSafety Commissioner detailing how exactly they're moderating content and the number of Australian accounts they're terminating.
Yeah, and interestingly, it'll see a new rating system introduced on the apps where users can immediately assess how safe the platforms are. So think of it kind of like the health star rating we have at the supermarkets, although you can't put much in store by those. But it's a similar premise. You pick it up and you go, oh, okay, well, this packet of Tim Tams is 0.5 of a star. Maybe I should avoid it today. Yeah. Similar with the dating apps, they'll be given a rating to say that they're this safe or not safe at all. Communications Minister Michelle Rowland has welcomed the code. It is currently voluntary, but it will be enforceable from next April. She says it's necessary to combat the deeply concerning levels of violence and abuse experienced by users. So another way we're seeing the federal government trying to crack down on these apps. We've seen it on social media. Now we're seeing it on dating apps to make them safer for Australians.
Yeah, and it's something that we talked about last month when Tinder launched a partnership with Chanel Contos. They were working on a consent program. It was an optional program. It was called Tinder's School of Swipe, and it was available online, not on the app. You can hop back and listen to that and just kind of get an understanding of what the apps themselves are doing. But I like this. I like that there's a top-down approach to this and that there's rules and it's actually enforceable.
There's evidence that house prices are starting to ease off across Australia, but they're not going down yet. The latest quarterly data from CoreLogic has found the cost of a home went up 0.4% in September and has increased by 6.7% so far this year. So while the prices have gone up again, it does, however, show a definite slowing in the crazy growth we've seen since the pandemic, with more investors and owner-occupiers selling up. And that, Chris, is likely down to the impact of high interest rates.
Yeah, and price rises in the rental market have also slowed. So they increased by just 0.1% over the September quarter. And that's the smallest change over a rolling 3-month period we've seen in 4 years. The report also covered the median value of housing nationally, which now stands at $807,110. But in Sydney, that price is a lot higher. That is $1.2 million. And in Brisbane, it's at $881,000. Whereas in Melbourne, it's at $777,000. Adelaide is at $802,000. And Perth is $797,000, Sash.
Yeah, so Sydney and Brisbane bucking the trend. And yes, we know all too well about Sydney house prices living here. Family in other states definitely don't have the same problems, or at least as big of a problem as we do when it comes to trying to crack into the housing market. And New Zealand has successfully reclaimed the Guinness World Record for the biggest ever haka. So that's more than 6,000 people you're hearing taking part in the traditional Māori dance on the turf of Eden Park in Auckland on Sunday night.
And there were famous faces there too, Sash. So Taika Waititi was there, US talk show host Conan O'Brien was also there, and they were among those attempting to wrest the record back from France, which had 4,000 people claim it back in 2014.
Yeah, so the ceremonial dance is a source of great pride for Māori people and Kiwis alike. It's not just a war dance, that's typically how it's referred to. Traditionally, haka was a customary way to welcome visiting tribes. It did also serve to invigorate warriors as they headed off into battle. It was also a show of physical prowess, but also an embodiment of cultural pride, strength and unity. And today that message still carries on. It's used as a sign of respect. It's performed on important occasions, sporting events, weddings, funerals, traditional welcomes. I'm going to drop a bit of a bombshell here though, because I watched a video of this world record attempt. I saw quite a few people in that crowd who did not know what they were doing. I don't think they got 6,000 people doing the haka. It was actually 6,500. That said, it was a group of about 5 people who they had no idea what they were doing. Guinness World Records, I think you need to reassess giving the record back to New Zealand.
And it's funny because I've watched that clip as well. It kind of reminds me of people when they come to weddings, like weddings of my family, we're Greek, and when people try to dance the Zorba, like it's actually really comical watching non-Greeks try to attempt the dance.
Yeah, I love the Zorba. I don't know how to do it though. I just kick my legs around.
And we expect nothing more from you, Sash. But look, I was trying to rack my brain thinking about what Aussie world record we could break as a nation. So immediately I was thinking like barefoot cricket, street cricket. Am I missing something? Is there something else that we as a nation could claim pride for?
Australia famously has no culture. I mean,
your words, not mine.
Cricket's a good option. Meat pie eating competition. The most meat pies in. The longest meat pie. You know how you can get like a rectangle meat pie?
Very good.
To make they do that in Italy all the time with the biggest pizza.
Yeah.
Let's do the biggest meat pie.
I condone this message.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines today. Next up is our deep dive, looking into the mission that's just started to bring 2 astronauts stuck in space back home.
Do you remember Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore, the 2 astronauts that have been stuck in space since June? Well, SpaceX has just launched a 5-month mission to bring them home from the International Space Station. The pair won't land on Earth until February 2025, turning their 8-day mission into an 8-month journey. Now, officials say they can't bring them back any earlier without disrupting other scheduled missions. And we covered this story back in August, and it all started with their Boeing Starliner having thruster troubles and helium leaks, which ultimately led to the decision by NASA to keep the pair at the ISS, with their craft returning back to Earth in early September without them. Dr. Rebbeca Allen is Swinburne's Space Technology and Industry Institute co-director, and she joins us now. Rebecca, thank you for coming back on the briefing. Last time we spoke to you, the future was unclear for these astronauts, whether they'd get home safely and how soon they'd get home. But the SpaceX capsule sent up to rescue the pair has officially docked at the International Space Station. What is next for this rescue mission?
Yes, it's kind of interesting because there wasn't a lot of announcement around the launch, unfortunately, with the hurricane situation in the US. But then we just kind of saw over the weekend that SpaceX was able to find a window in the bad weather and get the Dragon capsule up. So what happened is we have Nick Hague and Alexander Gorbunov, who are the astronaut and cosmonaut, and they're actually half of the original Crew 9, NASA Crew 9 team. And so, like you said, they're reaching the space station and they will join Crew 8. So that's 4 astronauts plus Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore. So there's actually going to be 11 astronauts on station for a little while until the Crew 8 team actually undock and head back down to Earth. And I was saying that I'm a little bit excited because they're going to be bringing back our experiment with them. So I'm kind of keen to know exactly when that's going to happen. And then Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore will make up the other half of Crew 9, and they'll be on station with Nick and Alexander until early February, when they'll come home and be relieved by the Crew 10. So you can see it's this regular resupply and change out of crew. But I think, now what we can say is, all right, we knew that there was uncertainty around the planning. We knew NASA didn't want to send them back in Boeing, and we saw Boeing undock and come back autonomously. And so there was still that, all right, but where is their ride home? So now that Crew 9 is officially there, we know that that Dragon capsule is just waiting, and that I'm sure Suni and Butch are kind of a little bit relieved. I know that they're probably excited because their little short mission, now that there's, security around when they're coming back, their little short mission is actually longer term, which actually astronauts kind of enjoy because they put all this training and time into preparing for it. So they're getting to really be part of 2 missions, which is pretty special.
So with these missions and how far they schedule them in advance, why couldn't they just bring back the 2 astronauts?
Look, I think that's a really good question. And the thing is, even though these things are really well planned out in advance and you have, the Dragon capsules performing amazing, you had one that was part of the Polaris Dawn mission, you have them on the regular resupply missions. I think the thing is, NASA likes things to be nice and tidy and organized. And when you just kind of bring in another mission, which hasn't been scheduled for months in advance, that brings in a lot of uncertainty. So even with all the protocols and planning that need to happen with NASA, I just don't think that there was really the time to kind of fit in another mission. So it wasn't just bring Dragon 7 out of the shed and load it onto the rocket. These things are all meticulously planned out. And for example, the next experiment we want to send up in 2025, we're planning almost 12 months in advance. So it's not like this, like a rental car just sitting at the lot. All of these things are very carefully supplied and organized. So unfortunately, it wasn't something where we could say, we know you guys are just meant to be there for 10 days. It's going to be more like 2 weeks. This was really kind of the best option in terms of doing it safe and reliable and according to NASA guidelines.
Have we ever seen a rescue mission like this before?
So in terms of something on the ISS, no, we haven't. And this comes into the fact that with the kind of commercial crew program, so this is where we're seeing spacecraft, which are not the shuttles that were originally built and operated entirely by NASA, but you're bringing in the privatization of space, which is great because in one avenue, it opens up more opportunities. But then you also kind of have more risk as well because the testing and procedures that are going on aren't the same necessarily. For example, Polaris Dawn was completely independent, whereas Dragon, is built by SpaceX, but then it's operated by NASA, and the same with the Boeing Starliner. So until these new technologies are actually fully tested, we can't really know what all of the risks are there. So before, there was a lot more planning and mitigation with NASA. Unfortunately, we have seen loss of life in crew programs, but we haven't seen the same kind of rescue mission. Obviously, going back to, the Apollo missions and Apollo 13, there were certainly some very dire situations, but not one where we actually had to go up and send one of these crews to be relieved, which is why, again, even though Boeing Starliner didn't turn out fairy tale ending, and we are still going to get valuable information from that. And hopefully it will still be a contender in the future. So if we did have one of these situations, let's say an astronaut got really sick, then you could send up one of the other crewed missions and you have more of, instead of a 6-month to 8-month kind of time frame, you have something which could be half of that. So I think that's really important to consider.
So as the space race kind of continues with the privatization and NASA, would there be potentially more rescue missions in the future if things aren't regulated in the same way?
Well, I think when we look, especially when we look to the moon, so on the moon is part of Artemis, we want to land, we want to have kind of habitats there. And we also want to have what's called the Lunar Gateway, which is the International Space Station, but for the moon. And then we also want to go beyond to Mars. Now, with a lot more diversified activity, I think with that complexity, obviously there comes more probability that something will go wrong. And so I think that's why just that factor, and then adding in the fact that you have more players, especially entirely private. Elon Musk with the Dawn, the Polaris missions, they're hoping to go all the way to Mars without NASA. So, obviously, I think that, not to go into the TV show For All Mankind, but I think, that's obviously a very extreme example. But we do have to consider that without the oversight of a government body that has to answer for those mistakes, then yes, I think, we can't rule out that there would be some kind of situation.
You mentioned before that NASA rotates the crews and everything like that. Is being stuck in space for 8 months, is that unusual? And what does that do to your body?
Certainly, astronauts have definitely spent more than a few weeks, a few months, even over a year in space. So the challenge is exactly what you mentioned, is understanding, even after short amounts of time, even after weeks, we start to see the effects of the limited gravity affect our bodies. And so the longer that we're there, that's where there's risk of some of these things, like for over a year, a lot of the results that came out of the twin study. So our very genes change. So the question is, the longer we're there, depending on people's different genetic compositions, could some of these effects then remain permanent? Could they be more severe depending on the person? And that's what's really important, unfortunately, for us to understand. So while Suni and Butch both have done some of these longer duration flights, doing another one that's a longer duration flight, do these things have cumulative effects? It's all really part of the research that's going into us understanding how well can our human bodies really undertake this long-term human spaceflight. But certainly physiological changes, so eyes, fluids, bodily functions, but then going down to our very genes, understanding our gut health. So all of these things, we do know that they are affected. We are trying to mitigate them as best we can right now, but then that's also part of the science that we're trying to understand exactly the amount of the effects that we're undertaking.
And what has the response from Boeing been over this whole saga?
Look, certainly, they are a company, right? So that it doesn't look good if you say, oh, yeah, you know what, that product was a failure. They're not going to do that. They're going to spin it as positive as they can. And to be fair, NASA, of course, is overly cautious because they have experienced loss of crew life. That's absolutely what they do not want to happen. And if there's a situation where they just don't have enough data to make a call, they're always going to err on the side of being as conservative as possible. So in Boeing's, kind of opinion, they felt like Starliner absolutely was able to bring crew back. But unfortunately, even preliminary data from Starliner's return have shown that it probably would have been more risky than even was originally thought, just due to the uncertainty around the cause of the helium leaks and their connection to the thrusters. So Boeing's been very positive about it. The thing is that the craft is back now. They can understand it. They can hopefully make modifications and then test it again and have something which is more reliable. So I think, again, it's a setback. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a failure.
So will Boeing be launching any more capsules into space anytime soon?
Look, absolutely. I think once they've evaluated the Starliner data and they look at the next Starliner capsule and making those upgrades, if you will, and making those adjustments, then they're going to immediately go back to NASA. And they probably are already having conversations around another crewed test and seeing exactly, in high detail, having the world watching, the pressure is on for them to deliver. So I think we'll definitely see, because as well, the ISS has an expected lifetime. Right now it's a planned deorbit of 2030. We're about to be in 2025. So with that amount of time left to service the space station, they absolutely have to do a crew test as soon as possible. So there's the pressure to fully understand what happened and to be able to perform another crew test and be able to for that spacecraft to enter service.
So what can we learn from this whole experience, the mistakes, the wins? How do you think it will impact future missions carried out?
It's an amazing kind of example because we've seen SpaceX, which is a company which is led by a very controversial figure, but still you've been able to see some tremendous accomplishments with Polaris Dawn, with the Dragon capsules continuing to operate exactly as they're meant to. So everything is completely up to spec. But then on the other side, you see Boeing, who have not been able to deliver, have had obviously issues with Starliner. And so it shows that there is certainly a role for private space companies to play, but that I think especially for the next, decade or so, or even into the future, really for the regulatory and the oversight, you want to see that strong connection with a reliable organization like NASA to say, we're going to hold you accountable. We've got these standards, we've got these guidelines, and that we together can accomplish incredible things for human spaceflight, which have these amazing translations back for Earth. But I don't love the idea of just seeing, private companies cowboy out and go, do things just because they say they can. I think that it's really important for the long-term success and to mitigate consequences to really be able to have that association with somebody reliable like NASA.
That was Dr. Rebbeca Allen, Swinburne Space Technology and Industry Institute co-director. And that was a really interesting point about the privatisation of space and how that might affect future rescue missions if we'll see more of them because of it. But thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.
Listener.